She's not on the list. This event is for members only. The words weren't shouted. They weren't even harsh. But they were sharp, delivered with the cool confidence of someone who was certain they were right. Certain that the woman standing before them simply didn't belong. Cleo Jones stood still. Composed. Calm. Her eyes didn't flicker. Her expression didn't change. She simply listened, just like she had done so many times before. She'd heard those words before. In boardrooms, lobbies, airport lounges, and cocktail parties. The faces changed. The tone rarely did. Tell us, where are you from? Because racism has no boundaries. Have you ever been judged based on your appearance before you even spoke a word? If you believe discrimination has no place in the world, hit that subscribe button and share this story, because corporate accountability starts with us refusing to stay silent. The venue was the Orchard House, one of those exclusive rooftop spaces in Manhattan, where the flowers are fresh, the lighting is gold, and the velvet rope separates those invited from those who just wish they were. Tonight's event was a high-profile tech launch and investor mixer, the kind that made headlines in business magazines, the kind where decisions worth millions could start with a handshake. And Cleo Jones had received an invitation weeks ago. She had helped fund the startup being celebrated. She had supported the CEO from day one. She wasn't just a guest. She was part of the reason the event was happening in the first place. But none of that mattered to the man at the door. He didn't ask her name. He didn't glance at her ID or scan her QR code. He just looked at her skin, her hair, her calm, silent posture, her quiet presence in a world used to louder introductions. And then he dismissed her. Cleo wore an ivory pantsuit. It was sharp, understated, powerful, the kind of outfit that made her feel grounded, not flashy. She carried a tan leather clutch. No assistant, no entourage. She didn't need noise to take up space. But in his eyes, she was invisible. Or worse, an outsider. She showed him her RSVP on her phone. He barely glanced at it. There's been a mistake, he said with a slight shrug. This event is private. Members only. You'll have to wait outside. There was no anger in his tone. That's what made it more dangerous. Because it wasn't rage that created barriers. It was indifference, casual exclusion, effortless erasure. Cleo could have said many things in that moment. She could have listed her titles, dropped the name of the startup CEO, pulled up the portfolio showing she owned a piece of the company being celebrated that night. But she didn't. She stepped aside from the velvet rope and stood near a potted olive tree by the wall. She wasn't angry. She was patient. She checked the time. She was early anyway. More guests arrived. Some were waved through with a nod. Some had their names checked. Others, men in suits, women in cocktail dresses, barely broke stride as they walked in. No one was told to wait outside. No one else like her. A white woman with an oversized hat breezed past the line. A man in ripped designer jeans gave the bouncer a chin nod and walked in without speaking. No one stopped them. No one checked if they were members. But Cleo? She was still waiting. She watched without reaction. She had seen this kind of thing before. Many times. It wasn't personal. It was systemic. She knew what it meant to be read as other in spaces she helped build. What it meant to be spoken over in boardrooms she chaired. To be ignored in companies she'd funded. This wasn't new. It was just public this time. Inside the venue, servers moved between white couches and glowing cocktail tables. The startup's logo was lit in neon against the wall. Guests laughed and networked, clinking glasses over small plates of appetizers. Someone gave a toast. Cameras flashed, and Cleo stood outside, just steps away, watching. Still, but not unnoticed. Someone nearby, perhaps another guest, perhaps a passerby, pulled out their phone. The contrast was striking. A black woman in an ivory suit, standing alone, being told to wait outside. A man in a dark suit speaking to her like she was a mistake. People walking in without a second glance. It was the kind of moment people had stopped ignoring. The kind of moment that now had witnesses. But Cleo wasn't here to be rescued. She was here to be remembered. And when the time came, no one would forget her. Because the woman they pushed aside wasn't just invited. She was invested. The next few minutes would shift everything. Not with shouting. not with revenge, but with the quiet unfolding of the truth. And it had only just begun. The air on the rooftop was thick with perfume and power. Laughter carried over the low hum of jazz as servers balanced glasses of champagne and gourmet hors d'oeuvres. Inside the velvet ropes, everything looked perfect. Outside of them, Cleo Jones stood waiting. She didn't look upset. She didn't pace. She stood with the stillness of someone who had long ago learned how to carry herself through the discomfort of being unwelcome. Her face gave away nothing. But inside, she knew exactly what was happening and why. She had been here before. Not this venue, but this feeling. The one where rooms filled with privilege made it clear that her presence was unexpected. The one where the calm of exclusion was dressed in politeness, and the rules bent for some while tightening against others. The doorman still hadn't bothered to check the list. Even now, as the line grew shorter and fewer guests remained outside, he avoided her eyes. 2 more men arrived, chatting casually. He gave them a nod, let them through. No questions asked. Behind the rope, a woman with slicked-back blonde hair stood sipping white wine, her eyes drifting toward Cleo. She leaned toward a friend and said something under her breath. They both glanced, then looked away quickly, as if unsure what to make of the woman standing still and proud in her ivory pantsuit. Cleo adjusted the strap of her clutch and turned slightly to face the skyline. The city sparkled beneath the setting sun. It was a view she'd always loved, the kind that reminded her of how far she'd come, and how much more there still was to claim. This wasn't the first time she'd been mistaken. She'd been called someone's assistant in meetings where she was the lead investor. She'd been asked to wait in the lobby at events where her name was on the keynote banner. She'd been offered water when she was meant to be offering deals. But she'd never let any of it break her rhythm. She knew who she was, and that was more powerful than anything these velvet ropes could block. Inside, a familiar voice took the mic. The startup CEO, young, driven, and full of energy, began addressing the crowd. His speech echoed faintly from the speakers near the entrance. He was thanking guests, thanking partners, thanking the people who had believed in the company from day one. Cleo smiled quietly to herself. She had been one of those people. She'd signed that first wire transfer. She'd sat in the basement office when they couldn't afford rent. She remembered him walking her to her car one night, thanking her for betting on his vision. "Without you, there is no launch," he had said. And now, at the launch party she helped make possible, she was being told to wait outside. The irony wasn't lost on her. But she didn't need the microphone. Not yet. The tension around her had started to shift. A young woman in a black jumpsuit nearby scrolled through her phone, then looked up at Cleo, eyes widening slightly. She tapped her friend. "That's her," she mouthed. A few others in line glanced toward the entrance. The video from earlier had already started circulating. Someone had posted the clip of Cleo being turned away. The caption was simple: "Investor denied at her own launch event?" People were noticing. And while Cleo said nothing, the silence was no longer hers alone. Back at the front, the doorman spoke into his headset again. He sounded annoyed now. Something about crowd control and a VIP complication. But he still hadn't asked Cleo for her name. Still hadn't asked why she was there. He had made up his mind long before she ever spoke. That's how bias works. It writes the whole story before the first word is spoken. Just then, a junior event coordinator arrived in a rush, eyes scanning the entry. She recognized Cleo immediately. Her face drained of color. She stepped toward the doorman, whispering fast, pointing discreetly toward the list. Cleo watched them quietly. She didn't move. She didn't have to. The damage had already been done. The question now wasn't whether she'd get in. It was how many people had watched her be kept out, and how many more would hear about it tomorrow. Because what happened tonight wouldn't stay on the sidewalk. It would travel through group chats, Twitter threads, and private DMs. People would talk. And for once, they wouldn't be talking about her being impressive. They'd be talking about how easily she had been dismissed, how confidently she had been erased, until someone realized what they had done. Still, the doorman hesitated, glancing from the coordinator to the headset, trying to decide how to fix something that had never needed breaking. And Cleo? She just breathed. Calm, quiet, powerful, because she knew what came next. The party was just getting started. But the real story, the one people would remember, was unfolding here. In the silence just before a room realized they had blocked the wrong person. And the only thing stronger than being invited in was being needed in. The music inside the rooftop venue pulsed with joy and excitement, but the tension outside the velvet rope was growing heavier by the minute. It wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was quiet, curious glances, exchanged looks, hushed whispers. The kind of attention that builds when people begin to realize that something doesn't feel right. Cleo Jones hadn't moved. She still stood near the planter by the wall, facing the skyline, her posture calm and her eyes steady. She didn't tap her foot. She didn't cross her arms. She simply waited, but her stillness was no longer invisible. It was becoming a spotlight. Inside the party, guests sipped cocktails and clinked glasses over deals and introductions. A few were already tagging the venue on social media, sharing photos of the stunning sunset and high-rise views. But some of those posts were different now. Some included short, shaky videos of what was happening just outside the entrance. One video, already gaining traction, showed the moment the doorman turned Cleo away. The caption was brief but sharp. "This event is members only, unless you're the black woman who helped fund the company." People were watching, and now, some of them were stepping back from the party to see for themselves. A young man in a tailored blue blazer quietly exited the crowd and stepped near the rope, pretending to take a call. His eyes were fixed on Cleo. He had seen her before, once at a tech pitch, once in a business magazine, but he hadn't made the connection until now. His friend beside him whispered, "Isn't that?" Others followed. Not many, just a few, but enough to shift the atmosphere. Someone opened the event app on their phone and scrolled down the advisory team section. There she was. Headshot. Bio. Listed as a founding backer of the very startup they were celebrating that night. Word moved fast. One whisper became two. One phone screen was shown to another guest. A quiet domino of realization started to spread across the rooftop. Back near the door, the doorman still stood firm. The junior coordinator had already alerted the event team, but no one from senior management had arrived yet. There was hesitation in his body now, a subtle uncertainty. He was starting to feel it too, the weight of the silence, the eyes on him, the shift in control. Cleo remained graceful. She had not said a word in 10 full minutes, and yet, the space around her felt charged. She had been patient, not passive, and now, that patience was turning into power. People were beginning to notice what had gone unnoticed before. Not just who she was, but how she had been treated. It wasn't the first time someone had been turned away unfairly, but this time, the person being dismissed wasn't anonymous. She wasn't powerless. She was important, connected, known, and now, she was seen. Inside the venue, the startup CEO had just wrapped up his opening remarks. He thanked his team. He smiled wide. He toasted the investors. His voice echoed across the rooftop, smooth and confident. Outside, someone recorded a clip of him speaking while panning the camera to Cleo, still standing alone. The message was clear. The one person who should be in the room isn't even inside it. The comments on the original video post started to grow. "She's the reason this company even exists. Why didn't anyone check the list? How many times does this happen and no one records it?" Even some of the guests inside were starting to feel the sting. People who had walked past Cleo without a second glance were now remembering the moment. The eye contact they avoided. The quick smiles they gave without really seeing her. They were realizing the truth in real time. One woman stepped outside and walked past the doorman, pretending to check her phone. She positioned herself at a distance and snapped a photo of the scene. The guarded rope, the crowd shifting, the woman standing still with her chin slightly lifted and the Manhattan skyline glowing behind her. It wasn't just a picture. It was a statement. Back inside, a staff member whispered something to the CEO. His eyes flicked toward the door. His smile faltered for a split second. Then he moved quickly, his voice dropping as he made his way toward the entrance. By now, the quiet crowd had grown. A few more guests stood near the perimeter. They weren't protesting. They weren't loud. They were just watching, observing the unspoken question hanging in the air. Why is she still outside? And more importantly, what happens when the room finds out who she is? The tension wasn't just about a mistake anymore. It was about what the mistake revealed. How easy it was for someone powerful, brilliant, and essential to be blocked simply because of an assumption. Cleo checked her phone again. No reaction. Just rhythm. She tapped once to confirm a message. She looked up at the sky. She waited. The door would open. But this time, it wouldn't be just for her. It would be for the truth. The truth that had been waiting outside for far too long. The moment the event coordinator stepped through the doors and saw Cleo standing outside, everything changed. Her breath caught in her throat. There was no mistaking who she was looking at. Cleo Jones wasn't just another guest. She was a name every person in the startup world knew. A leader. A backer. A woman who didn't just walk into rooms. She helped build them. But here she was. Waiting. Still outside. Still unacknowledged. The coordinator's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her tablet. She knew what she would find. She didn't even have to scroll. There it was, plain and bold on the VIP list. Cleo Jones, strategic partner, founding investor. She'd been on the list the entire time. The doorman looked confused when she whispered something to him. He stammered an apology under his breath, but Cleo didn't flinch. She didn't look angry, just aware. Her calm was louder than anything else around them. At that point, the damage had already been done. Cleo hadn't moved. She had simply waited. And in that waiting, she had given everyone else a chance to show who they were. Now, they had. The crowd had grown thicker near the edge of the venue. Guests who had once breezed past her were now standing near the entryway, trying not to stare. People whispered. Some looked down. Others glanced between her and the digital guest list, then back again with tight faces. Something unspoken was circling through the group. Guilt, discomfort, realization. They knew now. They knew who she was. But it was no longer about her name on a list. It was about what had been ignored, what had been assumed, what had been lost in that one dismissive moment at the rope. Cleo didn't need to say a word. The shift had already begun. The coordinator rushed to fix the error. Her voice, though low, was tight with nerves. She was trying to be gentle, trying not to look shaken. But Cleo wasn't interested in the flurry. She just looked out over the city one last time before turning toward the doorway that had remained shut for far too long. She didn't walk in with anger. She didn't march in to prove anything. She entered the venue the same way she had stood outside it. With grace, with silence, and with full control. Inside, the space sparkled with designer lighting and rooftop views. The buzz of conversation wavered as her presence passed through the crowd. Servers slowed as they moved. Guests turned from their conversations mid-sentence. People noticed. And they remembered. It was the same woman they had walked past. The one they ignored. The one they assumed didn't belong. And now she was inside. The screens around the venue rotated slides featuring the startup's achievements, its leadership, and its key backers. On the next cycle, a familiar image appeared. Cleo Jones. A photo. A quote. Her name. Some guests glanced up and froze. There was no more hiding. The young CEO spotted her from across the room. His face changed immediately. The excitement he'd worn moments ago shifted to shock, then worry, then urgency. He made his way toward her, fast but careful. Cleo saw him coming. She nodded politely, but she didn't step forward. She had already made her entrance. He said her name, reached out to greet her. He was speaking softly, trying to apologize without making it look like one. His words tumbled, explaining, offering, trying to recover what had already unraveled. Cleo listened. She smiled, but she didn't let the moment shrink, because the power had already moved. It was no longer in the hands of the host or the rope. It was hers, not because she raised her voice, but because she held her place. Guests nearby watched as the CEO escorted her toward the center of the room, where the most important conversations were happening. But even as she stepped into the circle of investors and executives, the shadow of what had happened still hovered over the party. People were adjusting themselves, fixing their tone, softening their words, now that they knew who she was. But Cleo didn't need that recognition. She didn't come for their comfort. She came for the truth. And the truth had already arrived, 10 minutes before she ever walked through the door. It arrived when she stood outside, dignified and ignored. It arrived when others started noticing. It arrived when silence exposed what no one wanted to admit. Now, she was inside. But the moment had never been about access. It had been about awareness. And now that awareness belonged to the room, it wrapped itself around every guest, every staff member, every onlooker who had watched without stepping forward. It lingered in the light of the chandelier and in the stillness of every uncomfortable smile. The party would go on, but nothing about it would feel the same, because Cleo Jones had entered, not through the door, but through the truth. And now, every corner of the venue carried the weight of what they had overlooked, and who they had overlooked, and who would never let them forget it. When Cleo walked further into the rooftop venue, the sound of the party dulled around her. The chatter, the music, the clinking of glasses, all of it dimmed, not because the volume had lowered, but because attention was shifting. Eyes followed her. Whispers passed between guests, names spoken quietly as people began connecting the dots. Her name wasn't just on the guest list. It was on the investment paperwork. Her title wasn't attendee. It was founding investor. Her presence wasn't just allowed. It was essential. And yet, she had been forced to wait on the sidewalk like a stranger. She moved through the space with the same steady grace that had kept her calm outside. Her expression was unreadable. Not cold, not smug, just composed. Her eyes met no one's for too long, but they didn't avoid either. She wasn't walking in to prove anything. She already had. The screens circling the venue rotated again, and this time, they stayed longer on the slide showing her name. Cleo Jones, strategic partner, FinEdge Capital. Some guests turned to each other in surprise. One man closed his laptop slowly. Another woman glanced at her drink and set it down. The mistake that had been made outside now echoed silently through every corner of the party. The CEO, still flustered, stayed close. His smile was shaky, his hands expressive, as he tried to make up for what had happened. He introduced Cleo to people who already knew her name, as if to cover what had just occurred, as if polite introductions could erase 10 minutes of dismissal. But Cleo didn't need an introduction. The room already understood. The real reveal wasn't in her name tag or her face on the screen. It was in the way people began remembering her. They remembered that she had led a funding round when no one else believed in the startup. They remembered the Forbes profile, the interview she gave last year about building capital for women of color, the mentorship program she launched that helped guide dozens of young founders. The reveal wasn't loud. It was layered, a quiet flood of recognition moving through the minds of everyone who had seen her wait at the door. Some couldn't look her in the eye now. Others offered small, hesitant smiles. A few murmured things they hoped would pass as apologies, soft words, lowered voices, unsure of what to say. But Cleo didn't need apologies. She didn't collect regret like trophies. She moved on. She had been underestimated her whole life. From boardrooms where she was assumed to be the assistant, to negotiations where men spoke over her until the numbers spoke louder. She had always made her way, not by asking for space, but by becoming someone who couldn't be ignored. This moment was no different. Still, the weight of it was heavy. She had walked into a party meant to honor growth, leadership, and equity, and had been left outside by the very culture the event claimed to challenge. The irony didn't sting. It clarified. It reminded her why she did this work in the first place. Not for validation, but for change. She found herself near the edge of the room, by a long table holding small plaques for investor appreciation. One bore her name. It had been placed there hours before the door refused her. She picked it up briefly, turning it in her hands. A server paused nearby, unsure whether to offer her a drink. The awkwardness lingered. She gave a simple nod. The tray moved on. Behind her, the party continued, but the tone was different now. The laughter was more careful. The conversations more quiet. The guests more thoughtful. Because every time someone glanced toward her, they remembered. Not just the mistake, but the silence that followed. The way she had waited. The way no one had spoken up. And they thought about what it meant, not just for her, but for every person who didn't have her name, her status, her stake in the room. Cleo didn't need to call anyone out. She was the call-out. Her presence alone challenged the space to reconsider itself. Later that evening, Someone mentioned she'd arrived late. Someone else corrected them. She was here the whole time, they said softly. We just didn't let her in. It was the most honest sentence spoken that night. As the party wound down, people began leaving in small waves. Some gave nods, some said nothing. A few managed to speak a sentence or two of gratitude or apology. None of it mattered. What mattered was the shift. The memory would stick. So would the footage. And the message was clear. The woman they tried to turn away wasn't just a guest. She was a gatekeeper. And while they closed the door on her once, she now stood with the keys in her hand. The real reveal wasn't who she was. It was what they had revealed about themselves. And Cleo Jones would carry that with her. Not as bitterness, but as evidence. Proof that even now, rooms still needed to be rebuilt. And she was just the person to do it. The party ended. The glasses emptied. The lights dimmed. But the story was just beginning. By the next morning, the internet had done what it always does when truth meets camera. A short video clip of Cleo Jones standing outside the Orchard House, being turned away, had gone viral. Someone had caught the doorman's words. Someone else had posted the moment her name appeared on the event's investor slideshow. Together, they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. The caption read, "Investor blocked at her own launch party. Quiet power speaks loudest." The video didn't need commentary. It told its own story. A woman standing alone, poised, waiting, the velvet rope between her and the space she had helped fund. Her name printed in bold on an LED screen while her presence was questioned at the door. The contrast hit hard. Within hours, business influencers began sharing the video. Entrepreneurs retweeted it with captions like, "This is why we need better gatekeeping standards," or "Never underestimate the one you overlook." Even rival investors commented, not to attack, but to reflect. Something about the calm in Cleo's body language made people look deeper. She hadn't argued. She hadn't shouted. She had simply been there, gracefully enduring what should have never happened. And the world noticed. The startup's inbox was flooded with messages. Some from supporters, many from critics. People wanted to know how this had been allowed. Why the event staff hadn't checked her name. What kind of space allowed exclusion to feel so casual? Meanwhile, Cleo said nothing publicly. She didn't need to. Her silence was still speaking. But behind the scenes, things were moving. Calls were made. Meetings scheduled. The CEO of the startup reached out again, this time not with nervous flattery, but with deep concern. He knew what the moment had cost, not just to Cleo, but to the company's reputation. Investors were watching. So were reporters. A statement was drafted, polished, reviewed by lawyers. But it couldn't undo what the world had already seen. The startup's leadership team released it anyway, apologizing for the mistake and promising to reevaluate how their events were managed. It was not enough. The venue itself, the Orchard House, felt the pressure next. They were known for their exclusivity. Their rooftop space had hosted political fundraisers, celebrity brunches, high-end tech events. Their website claimed to offer a premium experience that celebrates every guest. But now, people questioned who qualified as every guest. Phone calls to management went unanswered. Comments on their social pages multiplied. And more stories surfaced. Quiet ones, similar ones, people who had once been dismissed at that same door. People who were assumed to be assistants, servers, or delivery staff, even when they were high-level guests. The truth wasn't just about Cleo anymore. It was about the system, about how quickly bias operates, about how effortlessly power can be ignored when it doesn't come in the form people expect. And so, action began. Cleo didn't file a lawsuit. She didn't post a video. She made a decision. She called her legal team. She reviewed documents. She reviewed her options. Not for revenge, but for accountability. What had happened at that party wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a symptom of something bigger. Something she had seen too many times, in too many rooms. And this time, she wanted to build something better. She spoke quietly to the CEO of the venue's parent company, a man who had worked with her on past deals. She didn't raise her voice. She simply laid out the facts. The video, the aftermath, the opportunity. By the end of the week, she had an agreement. Not to sue, but to buy in. Discreetly. Strategically. By the end of the month, she had acquired controlling interest in the property group that operated the Orchard House and 3 other high-profile venues. There were no headlines at first. No press release. Cleo didn't need cameras to validate her power. She simply needed access. And once she had it, she began to work. The doorman was no longer there. Not fired in public, but removed quietly. His contract closed. The internal team that managed guest access was replaced. New training rolled out. Not the basic 2-hour bias module. A full program, developed by educators, informed by real experiences, focused on listening and change. She hired new leadership for the events team, professionals who understood that hospitality was more than dress codes and last names. It was about seeing people. All people. Then came the renovation. The rooftop lounge was redesigned, not physically, but spiritually. She renamed the private area where she had once been denied the Jones Suite, not for vanity, for memory, to remind every guest who walked through those doors that power does not always arrive loud, that sometimes it waits quietly, watches, and then returns, not to destroy, but to rebuild. By the time word got out, the venue's entire identity had shifted, not because Cleo demanded it, but because she embodied the lesson. The woman who had waited outside now owned the keys, and everyone, from the staff who once ignored her, to the guests who had passed her by, understood that the most important person in the room may be the one you fail to see. The consequence wasn't scandal. It was transformation. And in that quiet, steady way, Cleo changed more than a party. She changed what the room stood for. Months had passed since that night. The music had faded, the cameras had gone, and the viral clip that once shook an industry now lived quietly in the archives of the internet. But something deeper remained, something that didn't trend, but transformed. Change. It didn't announce itself loudly. It didn't arrive overnight. It moved slowly, like roots under soil. But once it took hold, there was no turning back. Cleo Jones had not simply bought a venue. She had reshaped it, rewired its purpose, redefined its role in the city's culture. And now, her work extended beyond the rooftop where the story began. What started as a response had become a movement. The Jones Suite, once just a renamed corner of a high-rise, was now a space where intentional inclusion lived and breathed. It was no longer just reserved for VIPs. It hosted mentorship roundtables, equity-focused panels, and pitch nights for underrepresented founders. Invitations no longer traveled only to the same circles. The velvet rope had been replaced with outreach. People didn't whisper about the room anymore. They studied it. They studied what it symbolized. And quietly, other venues took note. Across the city, other hospitality groups reviewed their own policies. Some introduced quiet reforms. Some updated their onboarding. Some asked Cleo for help. She didn't respond to all of them. She wasn't building a trend. She was shaping a standard. One of the city's oldest private clubs reached out. They had seen the video. They had read the follow-up. Their board had questions about unconscious bias. Questions that, until recently, they hadn't dared ask. Cleo agreed to meet, not because she needed approval, but because she believed in repair. That meeting led to a partnership. That partnership led to policy. And slowly, systems that once shut people out were forced to look inward. Cleo did not parade these changes. She didn't post photos. She didn't give speeches about the party. But she did speak, with purpose, when it mattered. She gave one interview to a Women in Business journal. The headline read, "We don't need louder rooms. We need wiser doors." The article went viral, not because it was angry, but because it was clear. In it, Cleo shared one sentence that stayed with readers long after they closed the tab. It wasn't that they forgot to check the list. It was that they didn't think someone like me could be on it. That one line became a quote printed on posters, pinned to vision boards, even engraved on an award given at a tech inclusion conference later that year, because everyone knew what she meant, and no one wanted to be the reason someone like her stood outside again. Meanwhile, her influence kept growing, not through force, but through trust. She was asked to advise new startups, not just on investment, but on values. She helped shape hiring processes that measured merit without defaulting to pattern. She rewrote event guidelines. She trained young leaders to lead differently. More importantly, she watched them listen. One young founder told her that, after seeing the video, he never walked into a room without scanning the edges, asking who wasn't being seen, who wasn't being welcomed. That kind of shift was hard to measure, but Cleo knew it mattered, because when you teach people to look past the surface, they begin to build from the root. She never sought credit for the reforms. Most didn't know she had advised the training modules adopted by 4 major venues downtown. Few realized she had helped write the visibility clause, now included in multiple contracts for guest-facing roles. But she wasn't there for recognition. She was there for the quiet ripple, the shift in culture, the slow, necessary undoing of assumptions. Of course, not everyone welcomed it. There were critics, people who said she made too much of a moment, that the doorman had just been doing his job, that not every mistake was about race, class, or gender. But Cleo didn't argue, because the work didn't live in debate. It lived in the difference between a closed door and an open one. And that difference was now being felt. A year after the party, the Orchard House received a city award for leadership in inclusive event practices. The person who accepted the plaque was the new director of guest experience, a woman of color Cleo had personally hired. She stood proudly in front of the very space that once blocked her predecessor. When the plaque was placed inside the lobby, it sat next to a quote on the wall. Visitors read it as they passed through the entrance. Power doesn't always wear a name tag. See people anyway. CM. Those 5 words were now part of the venue's brand, part of its truth, and part of its redemption. Because even the most exclusive rooms can be rebuilt. All it takes is one person brave enough to stand in silence, long enough for the noise to catch up. Cleo never returned to that rooftop for another party. She didn't need to. Her work was in the foundation now. Every guest who entered through those doors walked into a space she had changed, not for herself, but for everyone who came after her. And that was enough. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button to support stories that inspire change. Leave a comment. Have you ever been overlooked, misjudged, or made to feel like you didn't belong? Share your story below. Because when we speak up, or even stand still with dignity, we make it harder for others to look away. Let's keep building wiser doors. Together.